Hello everyone, good morning and welcome to today's The Hindu News Analysis. In today's news analysis, we'll be discussing about 6 important articles covered in the Hindu newspaper today. Coming to the first news article, AIIB clears $750 million loan to India for COVID-19. Beijing-based Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank has approved a $750 million loan to India to help strengthen its COVID response to the adverse impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Also, this loan is co-financed by the Asian Development Bank and it will be helping to bolster the economic aid for business, including for informal sector, expanding social safety net for the needy and strengthening the country's healthcare systems. So here, from the prelims perspective, we have to focus on two international organizations. They are AIIB and ADB. So the difference between, usually everyone gets confused about the difference between AIIB and ADB. So I'll be discussing about this briefly in today's video. So the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is a multilateral development bank that aims to support the building of infrastructure in the Asia Pacific region. It was formed in 2016. So AIIB is a very recent bank and its headquarters is in Beijing, China. Okay, and it has presently 102 members. So AIIB is mainly a China-led bank. Okay, so that, and China is a major stakeholder in AIIB. So that is one thing. And coming to Asian Development Bank or ADB. So ADB also, it is a regional development bank, but it is established in 1966, and it is headquarters in the is in the city of Manila in Philippines. So the formation is in 1966. It is also a multilateral development bank with the region served as Asia Pacific. So even though the region served of both the banks are similar or are same, the Asia Pacific, but the formation and the headquarters differ, and even who controls the major stake differs. In Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, it is China, and coming to uh, Asian Development Bank, Japan holds the largest proportion of shares, and it is also followed by United States. So ADB is the leadership of ADB is Japan and United States, whereas the leadership of AIIB is China. So this main difference you should be noting for from the prelims perspective. Coming to the next news article, Trump signs orders on police reforms. So, following the week of protest since the death of George Floyd, President Donald Trump has signed an executive order he said would encourage better police practices. So, we have seen that the death of a African American called George Floyd had happened recently. And after that, a lot of protests had happened in USA demanding rights for Afro American and against racism, right? So now the police reforms have been taken place, but he made no mention of the rolling national debate over racism. So according to the order, the Mr. Trump's executive order would establish a database that tracks police officers with excessive use of force complaints in their record. So a database of police officers will be created where complaints about them will be listed, right? Also, the order would give police departments a financial incentive to adopt best practices and encourage co-responder programs. So what are these co-responder programs? Co-responder programs are programs in which social workers join the police when they respond to non-violent calls involving mental health, addiction, and homelessness issues. So it is a form of similar to community policing, where the social workers from the community are also involved in the uh, involved in the actions of the police, right? So here you can briefly know about various community policing initiatives in India also. For example, there is a student cadet policing in Kerala, and similar such initiatives can be noted from the mains perspective. Mr. Trump said that as part of the order, the use of chokeholds, which have become a symbol of police brutality, would be banned except if an officer's life is at risk. So this is all about the news. Now, since the news is on police reform, the police reform and its progress in India becomes very important. So, especially from the mains perspective, from the prelims perspective, it won't be asked, but from the mains perspective, under the syllabus of GS2, the police reforms in India becomes a very important topic. And as coming to the optional of public administration, also the police reform becomes a very important part of the syllabus. Now, under police reforms, what we have to learn is the different commissions which have been set up. For example, there have been committees like the Gore Committee on Police Training, the National Police Commission, the Ribeiro Committee on Police Reforms, the Pandanabaya Committee on Police Reforms. So all these committees and their major recommendations should be read. Also, there has been some Supreme Court directives on police reforms in the Prakash Singh versus Union of India case. So under Prakash Singh versus Union of India case, the Supreme Court has also told some directives which are related to police reforms in India. So it is better to have a short note of this reforms directives under this Prakash Singh case. So that can also be noted down from the mains perspective. So that will be sufficient from this news article. Coming to the next news article, India China to ease tension, de-escalate. So India and China on Wednesday agreed not to escalate matters along the LAC following a conversation between External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Stark differences, however, remained in how both sides described the unprecedented events of June 15 and the clash that claimed the lives of at least 20 Indian soldiers in the worst violence along the border since 1967. So we have already come across this news article, which happened in the Galvan Valley, right? So, following the call, it was agreed that both sides would deal with the situation in a responsible manner, and neither sides would take any action to escalate the matters. So this issue had happened in Galvan Valley. We already discussed that. So coming in the next few articles, we'll be discussing more about the issues between India and China and how China's whether China's rise is a peaceful rise and all. So most of the articles today will be based on India-China relations. So you can better make some notes on this India-China relations because various dimensions will be discussing in today's newspaper video. So coming to the editorial of the day, disorder at the border. So with the death of at least 20 Indian soldiers and reports of Chinese soldiers casualties in clashes in the Galvan Valley in Ladakh, India and China have entered uncharted territory on the line of actual control because this is the first combat death since 1975 and the first such in the Galvan Valley since the 1962 war. So in 1962 there was a war between India and China, right? So at that time it was the last time that a death had happened in Galvan Valley and coming and so this is the first combat death since 1975 also. Okay, so the deaths occurred when the two armies had agreed to disengage and de-escalate the month-long standoff, which makes the clashes particularly shocking. So the clashes happened not when the tensions were high, but after deciding to de-escalate. So that is what makes the clashes and the deaths more shocking. China has now claimed sovereignty over the entire Galvan Valley. So this is a major concern for India because China has claimed total sovereignty over this Galvan Valley, which is an Indian territory, indicating that it is unlikely to pull back from this crucial and hitherto non-contentious area unless it is forced to. So earlier this was not a bone of contention between India and China. This was like it was under the Indian territory and China had never raised contention against this territory. But now this non-contentious territory has been taken over by China. Meanwhile, the reports that the Chinese troops continue to be well entrenched in the Finkers area or the ridges around Pangong So Lake that India has always patrolled and remain inside the LAC at the Nakula Pass are worrying indicators of hardening Chinese position. So we have seen that the Chinese issues have been happening across various points, like in Ladakh, multiple points in Ladakh, and even in Nakula Pass in Sikkim. So apart from the issues are still continuing at Nakula Pass and Pangong So Lake. Also, in order to prepare its response appropriately, the first step the government must take is to apprise the nation of exactly what has occurred since late April along the LIC, including incidents in Ladakh and Sikkim. So, the government should be clear about what is happening in these areas and it should appraise the nation about the progress of the situation. So, that is one way forward which has to be done. Also, the government must conduct a full investigation to the Galvan clash and put out clearer details of the lives lost. So that is another thing which has to be done. A true tribute to those soldiers will not only include ensuring accountability from Beijing, but also enforcing a full troops withdrawal from the areas occupied in the last few weeks. So India should ensure that the Chinese troops are withdrawn from the areas which it has captured in the recent months, right? So then only it will be a perfect tribute for the soldiers. So both the MEA, Ministry of External Affairs, and the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs have reaffirmed their commitment to dialogue as a means of restoring peace. But both sides must also acknowledge the situation as precarious, that is more tense, and that the recent days particular have undone the decades of painstakingly negotiated confidence building mechanisms. So there were various confidence building mechanisms between India and China throughout the years in order to ensure peace across the LAC, right? But now after this incident in the Galvan Valley, this confidence building measures have undone and it has been negated. So, without a full restoration of the status quo ante, the reparations for the casualties and as well as some of the honest commitments to abide fully by any agreement, talks with Beijing at this point might not mean anything more than just empty words. So, just by commitment to talks, it won't help unless and until any solid action is taken in the LAC by ensuring the withdrawal of the Chinese army. Right. So that is all about the editorial. Now coming to the next news article, history, the standoff, and a policy worth rereading. So this is again the relation between India and China. Here we are seeing some historical perspectives how India was able to manage China till now, like after the 1962 war till now, how India was able to manage China. So and what are the Chinese motivations in order to show this aggression presently. So these are some of the dimensions which will be discussed in this article. So the deadly clashes at Galvan and the ongoing standoff between India and China on the ridges of fingers around the Pangong Tso are a metaphor for the wider conflict between the two countries over all the areas that Chinese strategy refers to as the five fingers of the Tibetan palm. So this is a very important strategy of China. This is a very important concept which we have to know about. There is a Chinese strategy which refers to as the five fingers of the Tibetan palm. We already know the area of Tibet which is under the control of China. Now the China says that China has a strategy which says that there are five fingers of this Tibetan palm. So which all are those five fingers? The five fingers are, one is the Ladakh, then other one is the Nepal, the other one is Sikkim, Bhutan, and the Northeast Frontier Agency or Arunachal Pradesh. So these are said to be the five fingers of the Tibetan palm under this Chinese strategy. So this term can be used nicely in the mains answer writing also to include more specificity in the answers. So, coming to these five fingers, all the five fingers were most closely attached to India and not China. Though these are under the five fingers of Tibet under Chinese strategy, these are mostly under the control of India. For example, Nepal and Bhutan are mostly close to India till now. Okay, Nepal is slanting more towards China in recent days, but mostly over the decades it was more under the control of India. So China and Nepal, I'm sorry, Bhutan and Nepal. And coming to the other three areas, Ladakh, Sikkim, and Arunachal Pradesh, they are parts of India, right? So coming to India's counter move, so in the 1950s, India had signed the Panchsheel Agreement with China in 1954, and before the 1962 India-China war, the Nehru government had already begun to worry about some of the Chinese proclamations. So especially after the flight of the Dalai Lama to India in 1959, China had begun to demand self-determination in Kashmir. So this was the worrying trend which used to happen in the 1950s itself. Chinese government allowed Naga and Mizo dissidents into China for refuge and training. More importantly, the school textbooks there began to depict the five fingers as part of China, that is Nepal, Bhutan, Ladakh, Sikkim, and Arunachal Pradesh. So they were seen to be a part of China in some Chinese textbooks also. Then happened the 1962 war, and after the 1962 war, India had followed a three-pronged foreign policy uh, that provided an effective counter to Mao's five-finger policy over the course of the century. So even though we say that the 1962 war was a diplomatic failure of India, but there was some three-pronged strategy which helped India to keep China at bay for this much time, like after 1962 till 2000. after 2017, 2020 and all. Till now we were able to manage China somehow, right? So we'll be discussing in this article how we were able to do that. The first was a push for building border infrastructure and governance. In the mid 1950s, the government piloted a project to build the Indian Foreign Frontiers Administrative Service or IFAS to oversee the NEFA. NEFA is also called as Arunachal Pradesh. Okay. So these IFAS officers were selected from the Indian Administrative Service, Indian Foreign Service, and Indian Police Service, and they were on a rotational basis. Okay. So another thing was a special desk was created in Ministry of External Affairs for officers who would tour all the regions from NEFA to Ladakh in order to make suggestions for rapid development of these areas. So this was another measure which was taken. A special desk was created under the Ministry of External Affairs. So the IFAS, Indian Frontier Agency, Frontier Administrative Services, it existed till 1968. So an idea before its time, the IFAS roles has since been transferred to the Indian Army and the Border Road Organization. So the role of the IFAS is presently being done by Indian Army and the Border Road Organization. But it is an idea which is worth revisiting. So as the tensions are increasing, a new service called IFAS can be again reinstated in the civil services. Also, the chief ministers of Arunachal Pradesh and Mizoram has called for the resurrection of the IFAS. So this is another demand from these chief ministers. So the second prong were a series of treaties that were signed around that time with the neighbors such as Nepal and Bhutan, and the consolidation of control military and administratively of the other territories that acceded to India, including Ladakh as part of the Jammu and Kashmir and NEFA in 1951. So in 1950, India has also signed treaty with Sikkim that made it a protectorate state, and by 1975, the Indira Gandhi government had annexed the Sikkim and made it the 22nd state of India. So here we can see that how India was able to have control over this five fingers which are described under Chinese strategy. So we could see treaties with Nepal and Bhutan. uh, Ladakh was made a part of India in 1947, and coming to Arunachal Pradesh, it was made a part of India in 1951, and Sikkim was made a state of India in 1975. So these are the measures which were taken by India to gain control of this areas described as five fingers of the Tibetan state, right? So each of these treaties built unique relationships with New Delhi, tying countries such as Nepal and Bhutan in ways that were seen as a win-win for both the countries. So one of the reason was China has not been able to make inroads into Nepal and not with Bhutan is that the government renegotiated its 1949 Treaty of Perpetual Peace and Friendship between the government of India and the government of Bhutan of 1949 with the India Bhutan Friendship Treaty in 2007. So India was able to renegotiate this treaty with Bhutan in 2007. But when it comes to Nepal, however, despite years of requests from Kathmandu, New Delhi has dragged its feet over review its 1950 Treaty of Peace and Friendship between Government of India and Government of Nepal. So India was able to renegotiate the 1949 treaty with Bhutan, whereas coming to this 1950 treaty with Nepal, India couldn't renegotiate it. So new treaties may not in themselves reduce India's security threat from China in its neighborhood, but they create space for more mutually responsive diplomacy, right? So for example, India is able to maintain good diplomacy with Bhutan because the treaty was renegotiated. But coming to the Nepal, India's treaties are not being renegotiated, and this has affected India's diplomatic strength in Nepal. And that's why we can see that issues between India and Nepal are increasing in the recent days. Coming to the Tibet issue, for the third prong, India's policy towards the palm or Tibet itself should be looked at more closely as well. So there is a need for New Delhi to look into the future of its relationship both with the Tibetan refugee community in India as well as its future leadership. So we all know that there is a sizable number of Tibetan refugees in India. So one thing is that we have to focus on the Tibetan refugees in India, and second thing is that we have to focus on the leadership of Tibet also. So as of now, who is the leader of Tibet? So at present, the Dalai Lama has the loyalty of the Tibetans worldwide. But that is the present leadership. What about the future leadership? The future leadership, the Karmapa Lama, who lived in India after its flights from China in 2000 and was groomed as a possible political successor, has now taken the citizenship of another country and lives mostly in the United States. So here we can see that present leadership is under India's control, is having a good relationship with India, but the future leadership, is mostly the Karmapa Lama, he is mostly not in India, right? Also, meanwhile, China will without doubt try to force its own choice on the community as well. That is, presently Dalai Lama is accepted the accepted leadership of the Tibetans, but China will definitely try to bring its own puppet leadership over the Tibetans. Now, coming to Jammu and Kashmir, the recent issues, finally, it is necessary to introspect on how India's own regional reorganization of Jammu and Kashmir in August 2019 has changed the security matrix and the threat parameters for India and its neighbors. While Pakistan's extreme reaction to the move was expected, China's reaction was perhaps not studied enough. That is, the Chinese reaction after this Jammu and Kashmir reorganization was not anticipated by the Indian government. So, Beijing had issued a statement decrying the impact on Jammu and Kashmir and another one specifically on Ladakh, calling it an attempt to undermine China's territorial sovereignty by unilaterally changing its domestic law. For China, the worry is not Jammu and Kashmir, but for China, the worry is Ladakh. Why? Because in recent days, like in the last 2 days, we have discussed in one article. I think day before yesterday, we have discussed that Ladakh is a strategic area for China. There are two reasons for this. One of the reason is that Ladakh borders with a China's province called Xinjiang. Okay, that is the western part of China, which is actually a rusty province for China. There are issues which China are facing in the Xinjiang province. So that is one reason. The second reason is that Ladakh also borders Gilgit Baltistan, through which China's China Pakistan Economic Corridor, that is CPEC, which is a part of Belt and Road Initiative, passes through. So China has economic interest in this region, right? So that makes strategy Ladakh a strategic region for China. Also, Home Minister Amit Shah's vow in the parliament in August last year to take back Pakistan occupied Kashmir and Aksai Chin was not taken lightly either. So this was a bit irresponsible statement by the Home Minister in the parliament last year, and it has not gone well with China. Now, China's stakes in POK now go beyond its historical closeness with Pakistan. It's not only the Pakistan angle, but it relates to its investment in the China-Pakistan economic corridor that runs through it. So we have already discussed this. The impact of the new map of Jammu and Kashmir on the ties with Nepal as well is no coincidence. So there is proof enough that now more than ever, as the government readies its hands on dealing with China, it must not lose the sight of every finger in play. That is the every finger which China describes as the five fingers of the Tibetan palm. So this Chinese strategy, India should be well aware of this Chinese strategy when dealing with any solutions with respect to China. Coming to the next news article, is China's peaceful development over? So this relates to international issues which are caused by China, not with respect to India only, but with respect to other countries also. So earlier, China's rise was said to be a peaceful rise. So this was the idea of China's development. But presently, we can see that China's peaceful rise is totally over, and it is totally not at all a peaceful rise which is happening as of now. So on Tuesday, this news broke about the violent clashes between Indian and Chinese troops in Galwan Valley. That is one thing. Also on the same day, Chinese J-10 fighters briefly entered the Taiwan's air defense zone. So there are issues between China and Taiwan also. Also, Chinese vessels have entered the waters of Malaysia and Vietnam. Last month, Chinese Coast Guard ships pursued fishing boats in waters claimed by both the countries. So here we can see that China is having issues with multiple countries. So this is a newfound aggressiveness in China's approach towards its already troubled neighborhood. So we can see in 2017 also there were issues between when the troops from both the countries were locked in a face-off in the India-China-Bhutan tri-junction of Doklam over 2 months. That was in 2017. China has claims over South China Sea. The reunification with Taiwan is one of its self-declared goals. But what makes the current standoff different is China's readiness to use force in addressing these challenges. So China has already claimed many regions as its own, but till now China was not using that much violent measures. But now China is ready to even use force to assert its territorial sovereignty over these areas. So that is what we can see. That is a shift from earlier Chinese stance, right? Coming to a relationship with other countries, the relationship with the US is particularly bad, with the Trump administration now openly targeting China for its handling of the pandemic. Also, when Australia pushed for the investigation into the pandemic outbreak, Beijing punished the country by importing trade curbs. So there were trade curbs on barley and all from Australia. So that was another issue which is happening between China and Australia. Also in Hong Kong, which has seen anti-China protests for a year, Beijing has introduced a new national security law. Right. So here the article have discussed a lot of issues which China is facing. But from the UPSC perspective, especially from the mains perspective, we have to go through each of these issues in more detail. Okay, why I'll tell you. One thing is recently India Australia bilateral summit has happened, right? So that becomes very important from the UPSC perspective. So during this so for both India and Australia, China is a common concern. So it is better if you have an idea of what is going on between China and Australia. What are the reasons why the relationship between China and Australia are getting weaker, and why Australia is tilting more towards India? So here you can study about Quad and all Quad organization, Quad Plus you can read about. So that is one aspect related to Australia. And coming to US China relations, you have to learn about the trade war which is happening. You have to learn about the issue of Taiwan in the WHO seat. You have to learn about the uh, COVID pandemic related issues between US and China. So that is another dimension which you should be making notes on. And coming to the other dimension, you should be studying about the Hong Kong crisis. What is happening in Hong Kong? The special relation between China and Hong Kong under the one country two systems policy, that you have to be learning. And what has escalated? What has escalated in Hong Kong in the last couple of years related to this national security law? There is an anthem bill which is happening. So all this is, there is an extradition law which the China plan to bring towards Hong Kong. So all these issues you have to be learning with respect to China Hong Kong relationship. Apart from this, China's relationship with Taiwan should be learned. So this comes you have to go through back through history. In 1895 Taiwan was given to Japan under the after the Indo not Indo Sino-Japanese war. So later, after the Second World War, China took over back Taiwan from Japan. Then after that, the rule by China was ruled by ROC, and in the 1949 communist movement, ROC was taken away from China. So ROC had to run away from China to Taiwan, and they started a separate government there. And from then on, People's Republic of China or PRC is ruling China, right? So and starting from there, what is the economic and political relation between Taiwan and China? So all these things have to be learned. So you have to focus on Taiwan relation with China, Hong Kong relation with China, issues in the South China Sea, which is happening, and the US China relationship and the China Australia relationship from the mains perspective. Okay, now coming back to the article, the peaceful rise is now out of the question. So the idea of peaceful rise was voted by President Hu Jintao, who was Mr. Xi's predecessor, has adopted the peaceful rise or peaceful development. So as of now, we can see that the peaceful rise is not at all happening. So COVID-19 has brought on a sharper turn to China's foreign policy, because suddenly it was quite obvious that China was on the back foot. It was getting very bad press all around. Other countries were speaking out in open against its handling of the outbreak. So in its version, China is a rising responsible power and some tensions are parts of its rise. This is from the Chinese perspective. China says that as a part of its rise, some tensions are unavoidable. The China dream laid by the President Xi after he took power in 2012 seeks to turn the country into a wealthy, strong, and modern global power by 2049. So 2049 is the centenary of the Communist Revolution which happened in 1949. So this was the same communist revolution which I was talking about, which happened in 1949, whereby the ROC had to fled China and go to Taiwan, and later the PRC started ruling China. Okay, you have to go through this history of China a bit. Okay, now coming back to what is happening between India and China. Between India and China, they used to say that don't let differences become disputes. But what's happening now is that across the spectrum where differences which predate COVID-19, that predate even the peaceful rise policy, are now literally becoming disputes. We can see in between India and China also, the issues are going out of control, right? So this article discusses in a nice manner about the issues created by China in various part of the world. So each of these issues you can go in more detail. Coming to the other news articles, Prime Minister calls an all-party meeting on June 19 to discuss the Ladakh crisis. So this is a good step from the Indian Prime Minister to ensure that a consensus happens between all the major parties of the country, and the country as a whole can unite and face the China threat. So you can read the news article in page 9. Coming to the next news article, multilateralism post COVID-19. So this article also, it article discusses about how the world order will be, whether it will be unilateral, multilateral, or bilateral. So as of now it is mostly bipolar, like mainly two countries are controlling, it is US and China. So whether multilateralism happens post COVID-19 is discussed in this news article. It is on page 7. And coming to the last news article, a prescription of equitable and effective care. So this article comes under the health, under which it is discussed the how the COVID-19 should be tackled by better coordination and partnership between the public and private health system. So that is discussed in this article under page 6. So that's all for today's important news articles. I hope you like the video. Please press the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share with your friends. Have a great day. Thank you.